Part 3. Roman reverse at Gergovia, 52 BC. 32. Caesar stayed several days at Avaricum, where he found abundance of grain and other provisions, so that the troops were able to recover from their fatigue and undernourishment. It was now near the end of the winter and the start of the campaigning season, and Caesar had just decided to march against the enemy in the hope of either maneuvering them out of the marshes and forests or blockading them where they were, when some of the leading men of the Aedui came to ask for his help in a serious emergency. The situation, they said, was critical. Their old established practice was to elect a single magistrate to hold sovereign power for a year. Now, however, there were two magistrates in office, each of whom claimed to have been legally appointed. One was Conquest, a young man of wealth and distinction. The other was Cotus, a descendant of a very old house and a man with great personal influence and numerous family connections, whose brother, Valetiacus, had held the same office the year before. The country had become an armed camp. Both council and people were divided in their loyalty, and each claimant was supported by his retainers. If the quarrel was kept up much longer, it would mean civil war. The only way of preventing this was for Caesar to intervene and exert his authority. 33. It was most unfortunate for Caesar to have to leave the fighting front, but he knew what serious harm such disputes often cause. The Aedui were a powerful tribe, bound by the closest ties to Rome. He himself had done all in his power to strengthen them, and had shown them every mark of favour. And now that there was a prospect of their coming to blows with each other, and a risk that the side that felt itself the weaker might call in help from Vercingetorix, he thought it was his first duty to prevent such a catastrophe. As Aeduan law forbade the chief magistrate to leave the country, and Caesar wished to avoid the appearance of violating this rule of its constitution, he decided to go there in person, and summoned the whole council and the two disputants to meet him at Deketia. Almost all the councillors assembled there, and informed Caesar that the announcement of Cotus's election had been made by his brother, the magistrate of the previous year, in the presence of a mere handful of people called together in secret, neither in the proper place nor at the proper time. It was further pointed out that Aeduan law forbade the election not merely to the magistracy, but even to a seat on the council of a near relation of a person previously elected and still living. Caesar therefore made Cotus resign his claims, and told Conquest, who had been appointed constitutionally under the presidency of the priests, and at a time when the magistracy was vacant, to continue in office. 34. After deciding the matter in this way, Caesar advised the Aedui to forget their disputes and quarrels, and allow nothing to distract them from the war they had on hand. They might look forward to receiving from him the rewards they deserved when the conquest of Gaul was completed. In the meantime, they must send him without delay all their cavalry and 10,000 infantry to be distributed at various places for the protection of his convoys. He then divided his army into two parts. 4 legion and a part of the cavalry were assigned to Labienus to lead against the Senones and Parisii. Caesar himself took the other 6 legions and the rest of the cavalry and marched into the country of the Aeduans towards Gergovia, following the course of the Allier. On learning this, Vercingetorix broke down all the bridges over that river and began to march along the opposite bank. 35. The two armies were within sight of one another, and Vercingetorix was generally encamped opposite Caesar, placing patrols to prevent the Romans from making a bridge anywhere and getting across. Thus Caesar found himself in a very difficult position. It looked as if his progress might be barred by the river for most of the summer, since it is not usually fordable until autumn. To get out of this impasse, he encamped in a wooded spot opposite one of the bridges destroyed by the enemy, and next day stayed there in concealment with 2 legions, sending on the rest as usual with all the baggage, and breaking up some of the cohorts into companies so as to make it appear that the number of legions was unchanged. He ordered them to march on as far as they could, and when he had allowed enough time for them to reach their next encampment, he began to rebuild the bridge on the original piles, the lower parts of which were still intact. The work was quickly completed and the legions were taken across. Then, choosing a suitable site for a camp, Caesar recalled the other legions. When Vercingetorix heard of it, he was afraid of being compelled to fight a pitched battle and therefore pushed on ahead by forced marches. 36. 5 days' march brought Caesar to Gergovia, where on the day of his arrival he fought a cavalry skirmish and reconnoitred the position of the town. As it was situated on a high mountain and difficult of access on every side, he decided that it was hopeless to attempt an assault and that it would be better not to start a siege until he had secured his food supply. Vercingetorix, who had encamped near the town, placed the various tribal contingents at short distances round his headquarters. They occupied all the mountain heights within view and presented a terrifying appearance. The chieftains whom he had chosen to form his council of war were summoned every morning at daybreak to exchange intelligence or make arrangements, and almost daily the cavalry were sent into action with archers dispersed among their ranks to test each man's courage and fighting spirit. Opposite the town, there projected from the foot of the mountain a very steep hill of great natural strength. Once in possession of this, we should clearly be able to deprive the enemy of a considerable part of his water supply and restrict the movements of his foragers, but it was held by a fairly strong garrison. By starting out of camp at dead of night, however, Caesar dislodged the garrison before relief could come from the town, and making himself master of the position, installed 2 legions there in a camp connected with his larger camp by a double trench 12 feet wide, so that men could pass to and fro, even singly, without fear of being surprised by the Gauls. 37. While these events were taking place in Gergovia, Conquest, the Aeduan in whose favour, as told above, Caesar had decided the dispute about the magistracy, was bribed by the Aeduani and entered into negotiation with certain young men of his tribe, chief among whom were Litawicus and his brothers, members of a very illustrious family. He shared the money with them and bade them remember that they were free men and born to rule. It was the Aedui alone, he said, who hindered the Gallic victory which, but for them, would be certain. Their influence kept the other tribes loyal to Rome, and if they changed sides, the Romans would be unable to maintain their position in Gaul. It is true, he went on, that I am under some obligation to Caesar, though the justice of my case was so apparent that he could hardly help deciding in my favour. But the cause of national liberty outweighs any such consideration. Why should we call Caesar in to adjudicate questions involving our rights and the interpretation of our laws? We do not expect him to submit questions of Roman law to our arbitration. The young men soon yielded to the combined persuasions of Conquest eloquence and gold, and professed themselves ready to take the lead in the enterprise. But how to put it into execution required some thought, since they knew that it would be no easy task to induce the Aeduan people to take up arms against Rome. It was decided that Litawicus should march at the head of 10,000 men who were to be sent to Caesar as reinforcements, while his brothers hurried on ahead to Caesar, and the remainder of their programme was agreed upon. 38. On taking command of the army, Litawicus marched to a point within 30 miles of Gergovia, and then suddenly halted and paraded his troops. "Soldiers," he said, with tears in his eyes, "where are we going? All our cavalry and all our men of high rank have perished. 2 of our leading citizens, Eporidorix and Viridomarus, have been accused of treason and put to death by the Romans without trial. Learn the facts from these men who have escaped from the actual scene of the massacre. I cannot bear to describe what has happened myself, for my brothers and all my other relations have been killed. He then produced some men whom he had carefully coached, and they repeated to the troops the tale that he had already told. All the Aeduan cavalry, they said, had been butchered because it was alleged that they had entered into negotiation with the Arverni. They themselves had hidden among the crowd of soldiers and escaped while the slaughter was still going on. With shouts of indignation, all the Aedui begged Litaviccus to consider what they were to do. "It needs no consideration," he replied. "Obviously we must march straight to Gergovia and join the Arverni. After such a crime, can we doubt that the Romans are even now hastening here to kill us too? So if we have a spark of courage in us, let us avenge this foul murder by wiping out these ruffians." With these words, he indicated some Romans who had been travelling with him in reliance on his protection. The Gauls cruelly tortured and killed them and plundered a large quantity of grain and other supplies that they had with them. Litaviccus then sent messengers into every part of the Aeduan country and inflamed the people by the same propaganda about the massacre of cavalrymen and chiefs, calling on them to avenge their wrongs by doing the same as he had done. 39. The two Aeduans who were alleged to have been killed were serving in the contingent of Gallic cavalry, having been called up by a special summons from Caesar. Eporidorix was a young man of the noblest birth and very powerful in his own country. Viridomarus, a man of the same age and equally influential, though not of good birth, had been raised by Caesar on Diviciacus's recommendation from a humble position to the highest honour. There were rivals for power, and in the recent struggle for the magistracy, Eporidorix had been a strong supporter of Convictor Litavis and Viridomarus of Cotus. On hearing of Litavicus's project, Eporidorix came about midnight to inform Caesar of it, and begged him not to allow the misguided counsels of raw youths to detach the tribe from its friendship with Rome, which must happen if Litaviccus's army joined Vercingetorix, since neither their relations nor the tribal authorities could be indifferent to the safety of so many thousand men. 40. Caesar was much perturbed by the news that the Aedui were turning disloyal in spite of the special favour that he had always shown them. Without a moment's hesitation he started out with 4 legions in light marching order and all his cavalry. There was no time to reduce the size of the camp, since in such an emergency everything depended on prompt action, but he left Fabius to guard it with 2 legions. He ordered Litaviccus's brothers to be arrested, but found that he was just too late. They had already deserted to the enemy. Urged by Caesar to submit without complaint to the laborious march that the crisis necessitated, all ranks followed him with enthusiasm, and an advance of 24 miles brought him within sight of the Aeduan army. By sending forward the cavalry, he forced them to halt and prevented them from resuming their march. Orders were given that no one was to kill any of them, and Eporidorix and Viridomarus, who were believed by the Aedui to have been put to death, were told to go to and fro among the cavalrymen and speak to their fellow countrymen. As soon as the Aedui recognized them and realized that Litaviccus had imposed upon them, they stretched out their hands in token of surrender, and throwing down their arms begged for quarter. Litaviccus escaped to Gergovia, accompanied by his retainers, for Gallic custom regards it as a crime even in a desperate situation for retainers to desert their lord. 41. Caesar sent a message to the Aeduan authorities informing them that by an act of grace he had spared men whom the laws of war entitled him to put to the sword. And after giving his army 3 hours' rest, he started for Gergovia. When he had covered about half the distance, he met a party of horse sent by Fabius, who told him that a dangerous situation had arisen. The enemy, they said, had assaulted the camp in full force, and by continually sending in fresh troops to relieve their tired comrades, had exhausted our men, who on account of the size of the camp had to remain hard at work on the rampart without relief. Showers of arrows and every other kind of missile had wounded many of the defenders, but the artillery was of great use in helping them to hold out. The enemy had at length retired, and Fabius was now blocking up all but two of the camp's gates, strengthening the rampart with breastworks, and preparing to meet a similar attack the next day. At this, Caesar accelerated his march, and the soldiers made such exertions that they reached the camp before sunrise. 42. In the meantime, Litaviccus's first messages reached the country of the Aedui. Without waiting for confirmation, they accepted an idle rumour as an established fact, some excited by greed, others carried away by anger and impetuosity, the most striking characteristic of the Gallic race. All the Romans in their power were killed or enslaved, and their property was plundered. Convicta Litavis added fuel to the fire and goaded the people to frenzy, in the hope that if once they committed a serious crime, they would be ashamed to return to reason. Marcus Aristeus, a military tribune on his way to rejoin his legion, was ejected from the town of Chalon-sur-Saône with the promise of safe conduct, and the Roman merchants living there were also compelled to leave. Directly they started, the Gauls set on them and stripped them of all their baggage. As the Romans resisted, they continued harassing them all that day and the following night, and when many had been killed on both sides, called a larger number of their countrymen to arms. 43. Meanwhile, news arrived that the whole Aeduan army was in Caesar's power. At this, the tribal leaders came running to Aristus, saying that the government had no hand in what had occurred. They ordered an inquiry into the robberies, confiscated the property of Litavicus and his brother, and sent a deputation to make their excuses to Caesar. The object of these moves was to secure the release of their army, but the number of people involved in the outrages was large. Fascinated by the profits of the plunder, yet at the same time dreading retribution for their crimes, they began to make secret preparation for war and sent envoys to obtain the support of other tribes. Caesar understood this perfectly well, but answered the deputation in the most conciliatory terms. In spite of the ignorance and irresponsibility of the populace, he still felt the same goodwill towards the Aedui and would not judge them too harshly. Anticipating a widespread rising, however, and afraid of being surrounded by rebellious tribes, he began to consider how he could draw off from Gergovia and reunite the whole army without making his departure look like a flight occasioned by the fear of revolt. 44. He was still occupied with this problem when he thought he saw a chance of striking an effective blow. On going to inspect the defence works at the smaller of his two camps, he noticed that a hill within the enemy lines was completely deserted, although previously they had been so thick upon it that the ground was scarcely visible. He inquired the reason for this surprising circumstance from the deserters who daily flocked to him. They all confirmed what he had already discovered from his patrols, that the heights adjoining this hill formed a ridge that was almost level, but narrow and wooded where it gave access to the farther side of the town. The Gauls, they said, were very anxious for the safety of this ridge, feeling sure that if they lost a second height in addition to the one already occupied by the Romans, it would be obvious to everyone that they were all but imprisoned and unable to get away or to send out foraging parties, so every man who could be spared had been summoned by Vercingetorix to fortify the ridge. 45. About midnight, therefore, Caesar sent several squadrons of cavalry in that direction, with orders to scour the whole district and make as much disturbance as possible. At daybreak he had a large number of pack horses and mules brought out of the camp, unsaddled them, and ordered the drivers to put on helmets and ride round over the high ground masquerading as cavalry. A few cavalrymen who were sent with them were told to range over a wide area with the object of letting themselves be seen. All were to make a long circuit and converge upon the same place. These movements could be seen from the town, which commanded a view of the camp, but at such a distance it was impossible to make out with certainty what was going on. Next, a single legion was sent along the same line of heights by which the horsemen had gone, and after advancing a short way was stationed on lower ground, concealed in a wood. The Gauls now became even more alarmed, and the whole of their forces were transferred to the threatened ridge to aid in the work of fortification. When he saw their camps empty, Caesar told his soldiers to cover the crests of their helmets, hide their standards, and move across in small parties so as not to attract the defenders' attention from the larger to the smaller camp. He explained his plan to the generals in command of the various legions, warning them above all to keep their men well in hand and not let them be tempted to advance too far by overeagerness for battle or hope of plunder. He pointed out that their inferior position placed them at a disadvantage which could be remedied only by quick action. It was a case for a surprise attack, not a regular battle. He then gave the signal to advance, at the same time sending the Aedui up the hill by another route on the right. 46. The distance, as the crow flies, between the town ramparts and the point on the plain from which the ascent began was a little over a mile, but the turns that had to be made in order to ease the ascent increased its length. About halfway up, the Gauls had built a 6-foot wall of large stones, which followed the contour of the mountain and was intended to impede any attack. All the lower part of the slope was left unoccupied, while the higher part, between this wall and the town ramparts, was covered with their camps, placed close together. Advancing at the signal, the Romans soon reached the wall, climbed over, and captured 3 of the camps, so quickly that Teutomartus, king of the Nitiobroges, was surprised in his tent, where he was taking his siesta, and only just managed to escape, naked to the waist and riding a wounded horse, from the soldiers who entered in search of plunder. 47. As his purpose had now been achieved, Caesar ordered the recall to be sounded, and the 10th legion, which was with him, immediately halted. The other legions did not hear the trumpet because a fairly wide hollow intervened, but the military tribunes and the generals did their best, in accordance with Caesar's orders, to hold them back. The soldiers, however, elated by the hope of a quick victory, by the enemy's flight, and by the recollection of their past triumphs, thought that nothing was too hard for their valor to achieve, and continued their pursuit until they got close to the ramparts and gates of the town. Then shouts came from every part of the fortress, and those of the defenders who were farthest away, alarmed by the sudden uproar, thought that the attackers were inside the gates and rushed out. The married woman threw clothes and money down from the ramparts, and leaning over with bared breasts and outstretched hands, besought the Romans to spare them, and not to kill the women and children as they had done at Avaricum. Some were lowered from the rampart by their companions, and gave themselves up to the soldiers. Lucius Fabius, a centurion of the 8th legion, who had said that day in the hearing of his men that he meant to win a reward such as Caesar had offered at Avaricum by mounting the rampart before any other man, got 3 men of his company to hoist him up, and after clambering to the top himself, pulled up each of the others after him. 48. Meanwhile, the Gauls who had assembled, as related above, on the other side of the town to construct defence works, had heard the shouting, and were recalled by a succession of messengers telling them that the town was in Roman hands. Their cavalry loped up first, with a whole horde of infantrymen racing after them. Every man, as he arrived, took his stand under the ramparts and swelled the ranks of fighters. When a great crowd of them had gathered, the women who a moment before had been holding out their hands in supplication to the Romans began to appeal to their own folk, leaning over the wall with their hair flung loose in Gallic fashion and bringing out their children for the men to see. It was an unequal struggle for the Romans, with both position and numbers against them. Tired out with hurrying uphill and fighting a long engagement, they found it difficult to hold their own against troops just come fresh into action. 49. Seeing his men harassed on such unfavourable ground by continually increasing numbers, Caesar became anxious for their safety and sent orders to Titus Sextius, the general left in charge of the small camp, to lead his cohorts out immediately and station them at the foot of the hill, facing the enemy's right flank, where he could cover the legion's retreat if he saw them driven from their position by frightening off their pursuers. Caesar also moved his own legion to a slightly more forward position and there awaited the issue of the battle. 50. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting was in progress, the Gauls relying on their superior numbers and position, while our men trusted in their courage to see them through, when suddenly the Aedui, whom Caesar had sent up by another route on the right to create a diversion, appeared on our right flank. The similarity of their arms to those of the enemy gave our soldiers a bad fright, for although they could see that the newcomers had their right shoulders uncovered, the sign always agreed upon to mark friendly troops, they imagined that this was a ruse employed by the enemy to trick them. At the same moment, the centurion Fabius and the others who had climbed with him onto the rampart were surrounded and killed, and their bodies pitched down. Marcus Petronius, another centurion of the same legion, tried to break down the gate, but was overwhelmed by a host of assailants, and realizing that he was a doomed man, he was already covered with wounds, shouted to the men of his company who had followed him, "I can't save myself and you. It's my fault you're in this tight corner because I was so keen to distinguish myself, so at least I'll help you get away with your lives. Now's your chance. Look after yourselves." With these words, he charged into the middle of the enemy, killed 2 of them, and forced the rest a short way back from the gate. The men still tried to rescue him. "It's no use," he cried, trying to save me. "I've lost too much blood and haven't any strength left, so get away while you have the chance and fall back to your legion." So he went on fighting, and a few moments later fell dead, but he had saved his men. 51. Harassed on every side, our men held their ground till they had lost 46 centurions. When eventually they were driven back, the Gauls began to pursue relentlessly, but were checked by the 10th Legion, which was posted in reserve on fairly level ground, and the 10th was in turn supported by the cohorts of the 13th under Sextius, which, after leaving the small camp, had moved forward to higher ground. As soon as they reached the plain, all the legions halted and reformed, facing the enemy, and Vercingetorix withdrew his men from the foot of the hill and led them within his entrenchments. Our losses that day amounted to nearly 700. 52. The next day Caesar paraded the troops and reprimanded them for their rashness and impetuosity. They had decided for themselves, he said, to advance farther and attack the town, neither halting when the retreat was sounded, nor obeying the military tribunes and generals who tried to restrain them. He stressed the disadvantage of an unfavorable position, explaining the motives which had dictated his action at Avaricum when, although he had caught the enemy without their general or their cavalry, he preferred to sacrifice a certain victory rather than incur even light casualties by fighting on unfavorable ground. "Much as I admire the heroism that you showed," he went on, "in refusing to be daunted by a fortified camp, a high mountain, and a walled fortress, I cannot too strongly condemn your bad discipline and your presumption in thinking that you know better than your commander-in-chief how to win a victory or to foresee the results of an action. I want obedience and self-restraint from my soldiers just as much as courage in the face of danger." 53. He concluded his speech with words of encouragement, telling the men not to be upset by a reverse which was due to their unfavorable position and not the enemy's fighting quality. As he had not changed his mind regarding the advisability of a retirement, Caesar then led the legions out of camp and formed line of battle in a strong position. Vercingetorix, however, still remained within his entrenchments and would not come down into the plain, and after a cavalry skirmish which resulted in favor of the Romans, Caesar marched the army back into camp. After offering battle again the next day, he decided that he had done enough to humble the conceit of the Gauls and restore the confidence of his own troops, and he therefore set out for the country of the Aedui. Still the enemy did not follow, and on the 3rd day Caesar reached the river Allier, repaired a broken-down bridge, and marched his army across.